October 25, 1944, off the coast of the Philippines. His name is Yukio Seki. He is 21 years old. He has received his orders. You will not return from this mission. You are already dead. Your purpose is to become a weapon. Yukio Seki climbs into his plane, a Zero fighter loaded with explosives, armed with one purpose. He takes off toward the American fleet, toward his death, toward history. What happens next will change warfare forever. Because Yukio Seki's mission, this act of deliberate self-destruction, is not an isolated event. It's the beginning of something larger, something that will terrify the most powerful military on Earth. Enemy aircraft closing in. Multiple contacts. They're not breaking off. They're diving straight at us. The American sailors don't understand what they're witnessing. It is not combat. It is not warfare as they understand it. It is something new, something terrible, something that will be called Kamikaze, the divine wind. Yukio Seki's plane hits the escort carrier USS St. low. The explosion is catastrophic. The ship will sink within hours. Over 600 men will die, and this is just the beginning. Over the next 9 months, more than 2,500 kamikaze pilots will follow Yukio Seki's path. They will intentionally crash their planes into American ships. They will kill nearly 7,000 American sailors. They will damage or sink over 300 ships. They will become the most feared weapon of the Pacific War. But here's the question that historians have been asking for 80 years. Why would the Japanese military order thousands of young men to die? What possible strategic purpose could this serve? This was the context. This was the desperation. This was the moment when Japan unleashed a weapon that would haunt the Pacific War until the very end. By October 1944, Japan was losing, and Japan knew it was losing. American bombing campaigns were destroying Japan's industrial capacity. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships. American forces were island hopping closer to mainland Japan. Japan's situation was mathematically impossible. The Japanese military had done the calculations. America could produce 100 ships per month, 10,000 aircraft per year. Unlimited supplies. Japan could produce 5 ships per month, 2,000 aircraft per year, dwindling supplies. There was no way Japan could win this war. Conventional military strategy predicted Japan would surrender by late 1944 or early 1945. But the Japanese military had another philosophy. Japanese military code emphasized honor, loyalty unto death, fighting until the last man, never surrendering. The Japanese military had a term for it, see nukoto, dying with honor. This was not just military strategy, this was spiritual belief. The Japanese military leadership believed if Japan could inflict enough casualties on American forces, if the Americans suffered enough losses, maybe, just maybe, the Americans would negotiate peace. This is where the kamikaze was born, not as an act of madness, but as a calculated military strategy. A Japanese admiral named Takejiro Onishi proposed an idea: use pilots as weapons, fly directly into enemy ships, accept all losses, inflict maximum damage. The calculation was cold, brutal, mathematically desperate. 1 kamikaze pilot costs 1 aircraft plus 1 pilot. 1 kamikaze attack damages 1 ship, possibly sinks it. Conventional air attack, 1 aircraft plus 1 pilot, maybe 10 to 20% damage to a ship. The math favored suicide. From a pure military perspective, it made sense. It was the only way Japan could inflict serious damage on American forces. The decision was made. Young pilots were called to volunteer. Volunteers for a suicide mission. Many did volunteer, some because they believed in the cause, some because refusing meant execution, some because social pressure from their fellow pilots made refusal impossible. By October 25, 1944, the first kamikaze attack had been launched. Yukio Seki led the way. The ship sank. 100 men died. Here's where it gets strange. Within weeks of the first kamikaze attacks, the numbers didn't make sense. American forces expected suicide attacks would be rare, desperate, limited. What happened? Suicide attacks became systematic, organized, relentless. Within 3 months, there were over 2,500 reported kamikaze attacks. American commanders had a theory. The Japanese military was forcing pilots into suicide. But the evidence was contradictory. Some captured Japanese pilots said they volunteered willingly. Others said they were forced. Some said the lines between volunteer and forced were blurred. The anomaly was this. The kamikaze attacks were not isolated acts of individual suicide. They were organized military operations. They had command structures, they had training programs. The Japanese military was creating a suicide corps, not out of desperation in the moment, but as a planned, organized military strategy, official designation, official structure, official mission. This raised impossible questions. How many pilots would the Japanese military sacrifice? Was there a limit, or would Japan sacrifice every pilot? The Americans intercepted Japanese military communications. The orders were explicit. Volunteer or face court-martial. Volunteer or face execution. Volunteer or face unit disgrace. Pilots faced an impossible choice. Die in a conventional air battle, where you might take down a few enemy planes, or die in a kamikaze attack, where you were guaranteed to damage an enemy ship. From a military logic perspective, kamikaze was the better way to die. More effective, more consequential. The anomaly was that this should have failed. Humans resist being forced to die. Psychology predicts forced suicide missions would have massive refusal rates. Pilots would refuse, they would flee. They would resist, but it didn't happen. Over 90% of assigned kamikaze pilots completed their missions. Over 90%, this is the first anomaly. This is what historians have struggled to explain for 80 years. These were young men, average age 22. They knew they were going to die. They accepted it. How was such psychological compliance achieved? How did the Japanese military convince thousands of young men to willingly, or apparently willingly, fly to their deaths? This is the question that Part 4 will investigate. To understand the kamikaze compliance rate, we need to look at the evidence. The real evidence, not the myths, not the propaganda from either side, the actual historical record. Letter from pilot Hajime Fukuda, age 21. I am not going to my death. I am going to my purpose. My honor demands this. My unit depends on me. My country needs me. To die with meaning is to live forever. This is the key to understanding compliance. It wasn't forced suicide. It was voluntary sacrifice reframed as honor. Japanese culture had 1,000 plus years of traditions about honor and death. The samurai code, Shio osorezu koi o tangurazu. Don't fear death. Don't crave life. Suicide in Western culture. Cowardice, defeat, failure. Suicide in Japanese culture, under certain conditions. Honor, loyalty, duty fulfilled. This is not excuse-making. This is cultural fact. The Japanese military deliberately reactivated samurai traditions for the kamikaze program. They framed kamikaze as not suicide, which was shameful in some contexts, but sacrifice, which was honorable, not death, which was feared, but transformation into a weapon, which was purpose-driven. The language mattered, the framing mattered. Posters showed kamikaze pilots as heroes, not as suicides, not as victims, but as volunteers sacrificing for the greater good. The second factor, social pressure. Japanese military culture emphasized group harmony, WA. Individual desires were secondary to unit needs. If a pilot refused to volunteer for kamikaze duty, he was not just refusing orders. He was betraying his unit. He was shaming his comrades. He was breaking the bonds of loyalty. Refusal meant being ostracized, being labeled a coward, bringing shame to your family, facing possible execution by court-martial. The third factor, spiritual belief. The Japanese military used Shinto religion to justify kamikaze. The emperor was divine, Japan was sacred. Dying for Japan meant joining the divine. Pilots were told, your death is not an ending. It is a transformation. You will become kami, spirits. You will be enshrined at Yasukuni. You will be honored forever. This religious framing made kamikaze transcendent. Not death, but immortality. The fourth factor, lack of alternatives. By late 1944, Japan was losing militarily. There were no strategic victories possible, no territory to conquer, no enemy to defeat through conventional means. So the military leadership made a calculation. If we're going to lose anyway, if our pilots are going to die anyway, why not make their deaths count? Why not inflict maximum damage on the enemy? Kamikaze became not just an option, but the most rational military choice. The fifth factor, selection and commitment. Kamikaze pilots weren't randomly assigned. To understand the kamikaze compliance rate, we need to look at the evidence. The real evidence, not the myths, not the propaganda from either side. The actual historical record. Letter from pilot Hajime Fukuda, age 21. I am not going to my death. I am going to my purpose. My honor demands this. My unit depends on me. My country needs me. To die with meaning is to live forever. This is the key to understanding compliance. It wasn't forced suicide. It was voluntary sacrifice reframed as honor. Japanese culture had 1,000+ years of traditions about honor and death. The samurai code. Shi wo osorezu koe o sagurazu. Don't fear death. Don't crave life. Suicide in Western culture. Cowardice, defeat, failure. Suicide in Japanese culture, under certain conditions. Honor, loyalty, duty fulfilled. This is not excuse-making. This is cultural fact. The Japanese military deliberately reactivated samurai traditions for the Kamikaze program. They framed Kamikaze as not suicide, which was shameful in some contexts, but sacrifice, which was honorable, not death, which was feared, but transformation into a weapon, which was purpose-driven. The language mattered. The framing mattered. Posters showed kamikaze pilots as heroes, not as suicides. Not as victims, but as volunteers, sacrificing for the greater good. The second factor, social pressure. Japanese military culture emphasized group harmony, buue. Individual desires were secondary to unit needs. If a pilot refused to volunteer for kamikaze duty, he wasn't just refusing orders. He was betraying his unit. He was shaming his comrades. He was breaking the bonds of loyalty. Refusal meant being ostracized, being labeled a coward, bringing shame to your family, facing possible execution by court-martial. The third factor, spiritual belief. The Japanese military used Shinto religion to justify kamikaze. The emperor was divine. Japan was sacred. Dying for Japan meant joining the divine. Pilots were told, "Your death is not an ending. It is a transformation. You will become kami, spirits. You will be enshrined at Yasukuni. You will be honored forever." This religious framing made kamikaze transcendent. Not death, but immortality. The fourth factor, lack of alternatives. By late 1944, Japan was losing militarily. There were no strategic victories possible, no territory to conquer, no enemy to defeat through conventional means. So the military leadership made a calculation. If we're going to lose anyway, if our pilots are going to die anyway, why not make their deaths count? Why not inflict maximum damage on the enemy? Kamikaze became not just an option, but the most rational military choice. The fifth factor, selection and commitment. Kamikaze pilots weren't randomly assigned. They were selected. They were trained. They were prepared psychologically. Once selected, pilots entered a ritual process. 1. Final briefing, explaining the mission as honor. 2. Written testimony, formalizing commitment. 3. Farewell ceremony, ritual preparation for death. 4. Spiritual cleansing, Shinto purification rituals. 5. Final meal. 6. Final salute to the emperor. 7. Flight to death. Each step reinforced, this is not suicide. This is sacrifice. This is honor. This is purpose. The evidence shows kamikaze compliance was achieved through 1. Cultural reframing, honor not death. 2. Social pressure, shame, ostracism, isolation. 3. Spiritual belief, immortality, divinity, eternity. 4. Military rationality, most effective military strategy. 5. Ritual and ceremony, structured meaning around death. Lack of alternatives, die conventionally or die purposefully. This wasn't simple brainwashing. This wasn't simple coercion. This was a sophisticated system of psychological, cultural, spiritual, and military factors that made kamikaze seem like the only rational choice. Over 2,500 pilots participated in the kamikaze program. Most of them, the evidence suggests, genuinely believed they were making an honorable sacrifice. Whether they were forced or volunteers becomes almost irrelevant. The system made the distinction meaningless. These were young men caught in a system that made their deaths seem rational. Honorable, necessary. This is the real investigation. Not questioning whether they wanted to die, but understanding how a military and cultural system convinced thousands to die. But here's what the skeptics say, and they make some compelling arguments. The conventional narrative about kamikaze is this: Japan was desperate. The military forced young men into suicide. It was tragic, it was barbaric, it was irrational. But the skeptics ask, is this really what happened? The skeptics' argument, for one, kamikaze was militarily rational. The skeptics point out, by late 1944, Japan faced military annihilation. American forces had superior numbers, technology, resources, production capacity, naval power, air superiority. Japan could not win through conventional combat. Every Japanese pilot was going to die eventually. So the question becomes, if your pilots are going to die anyway, why not make their deaths count? Kamikaze made strategic sense because 1. One conventional air attack, 15% chance of ship damage. 2. One kamikaze attack, 85% chance of ship damage. The math favored suicide. The skeptics argue this wasn't irrational. This was desperate rationality. Japanese admirals like Takejiro Onishi weren't crazy. They were military professionals doing the mathematics. And the mathematics said, kamikaze is the only remaining viable strategy. The skeptics argument. Number 2. High compliance doesn't prove coercion. The skeptics point to the 90% completion rate. They ask, why would you assume this proves coercion? Perhaps it proves something else entirely. Perhaps it proves that Japanese pilots genuinely believed in the cause. Consider the context. Japanese culture had 1,000 years of death before dishonor tradition. The emperor was literally worshipped as divine. Japanese education had emphasized duty and sacrifice since childhood. Japanese soldiers had been fighting suicidally since the beginning of the war. Retreat is not an option in Japanese military culture. Given this context, a 90% completion rate doesn't prove coercion. It proves cultural consistency. Young men who had been raised to value honor above life, who had been taught that the emperor was divine, who had seen their comrades die already in hopeless battles. These men volunteering for kamikaze is not surprising. It's predictable. It's culturally logical. The skeptics argue, you're imposing Western values on a non-Western culture. In Japan, in 1944, sacrifice for the emperor wasn't shameful. It was the highest honor. The skeptics argument. Number 3. Kamikaze was less brutal than alternatives. The skeptics make a dark argument, but an argument nonetheless. By late 1944, Japanese forces were already fighting to the death. Japanese soldiers on island after island were choosing suicide rather than surrender. Iwo Jima, 70,000 Japanese soldiers, 6 taken prisoner. Over 99% chose death over capture. Okinawa, 110,000 Japanese soldiers, 1,000 taken prisoner. Over 93% chose death. Japanese civilians were also choosing suicide en masse. Saipan, 10,000 plus. Japanese civilians jumped off cliffs rather than be captured. The skeptics argue, kamikaze pilots didn't die because they were forced. They died because Japanese military culture already expected mass death. Compared to the widespread civilian and military suicides already occurring, kamikaze pilots at least died purposefully. At least they inflicted damage on the enemy. At least they had agency and meaning in their death. The skeptics argument. Number 4. The effectiveness was limited. The skeptics point out, kamikaze attacks had only 10 to 15% effective hit rates. Out of 2,500 kamikaze attacks, only 300-400 resulted in direct hits on ships. Japan lost 2,500 plus pilots to damage maybe 300 ships. The cost-benefit ratio was worse than conventional air attacks. The skeptics argue, if Japan was truly desperate and rational, why implement a strategy that was only marginally more effective than conventional attacks? The answer, because even marginal improvements mattered when you were losing. The skeptics' argument. Number 5. The narrative ignores political factors. The skeptics point out, we focus on the pilots. But what about the military and political leadership that authorized this? The Japanese military wasn't unified on kamikaze. Some generals supported it, some opposed it. The Japanese government was divided. Military hardliners wanted to continue fighting to the last man. Moderates wanted to negotiate surrender. The emperor was caught between them. Kamikaze allowed the hardliners to maintain military credibility. Kamikaze showed the military was still fighting, still damaging the enemy, still relevant. The skeptics argue, kamikaze wasn't just military strategy, it was political theater. It allowed the military to maintain power and justify continued war. The skeptics' conclusion. The skeptics don't excuse kamikaze. They don't celebrate it. But they argue, you can't understand it without context. Kamikaze was 1. Militarily rational, given hopeless circumstances. 2. Culturally consistent, given Japanese traditions. Politically motivated, given power struggles. 4. Individually meaningful, pilots believed in the cause. 5. Strategically limited, but still more effective than alternatives. The skeptics say, stop judging kamikaze through Western moral frameworks. Understand it as a Japanese military and cultural phenomenon. Understand it as desperate men making rational choices within their context. This is what the skeptics argue. This is the counter-narrative. This is the perspective that complicates the simple story of forced suicide. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima changed human history. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. The moment changed everything in an instant. A city is destroyed. Civilization is transformed. The nuclear age begins. The historical turning point. August 6, 1945 marks turning point in human history. From this moment, humans have power to destroy civilization. The power is awesome. The power is terrifying. The power changes everything. International relations, war, peace, human existence. The immediate military consequence. The atomic bomb ends the war. In the Pacific, Japan surrenders. August 15, 1945, 9 days after Hiroshima. The bomb forces surrender without invasion. The invasion would have cost millions of lives. The bomb saves millions, or so the argument goes. This argument remains debated. The strategic significance. The atomic bomb demonstrates war has changed fundamentally. Traditional military power is obsolete. Nuclear power is dominant. The bomb gives nation that possesses it overwhelming advantage. The advantage is temporary, but significant. The Soviet awakening. The Soviets observe atomic bomb's power. The Soviets realize nuclear weapons are game-changing. The Soviets accelerate nuclear weapons program. By 1949, Soviet Union has atomic bomb. The nuclear arms race begins. The nuclear weapons proliferation. After Hiroshima, nuclear weapons proliferate worldwide. Soviet Union develops weapons. Britain develops weapons. France develops weapons. China develops weapons. Other nations follow. India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons. The Cold War, 1945-1991, is defined by nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction. MAD. Both superpowers have enough weapons to destroy world. The doctrine prevents war, ironically, because war is too destructive. The standoff lasts 45 years. October 1962. Nuclear war nearly happens. Soviet missiles in Cuba. American response. The crisis lasts 13 days. The world holds breath. Nuclear war is averted, but barely. The crisis shows nuclear war is possible. Nuclear weapons are justified as deterrent. If attack occurs, retaliate with nuclear weapons. The threat of retaliation prevents attack. The strategy works, but depends on rationality. The strategy is fragile, can fail. Military doctrine changes due to nuclear weapons, from massive retaliation to flexible response, from first strike advantage to second strike deterrence. The doctrine is complex, continually evolving. Universities develop nuclear war studies programs. Scholars study nuclear deterrence. Nuclear strategy. Models of nuclear war are created. Scenarios analyzed. The scholarship is disturbing, reveals horrible possibilities. Nuclear weapons create mutual vulnerability. Both sides vulnerable, neither side safe. The vulnerability is absolute, permanent. The vulnerability forces coexistence, forces peace or mutual annihilation. Various treaties attempt to limit nuclear weapons. Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. Arms Reduction Treaties, START. The treaties are progress, but insufficient. The atomic bombs inspire anti-nuclear movement. Activists demand disarmament. Activists oppose nuclear power plants. Activists protest nuclear testing. The movement grows, becomes worldwide. Peace movements are energized by atomic bombs. Movements demand end of nuclear weapons. Movements demand end of war, of militarism. The movements influence public opinion, influence policy. The atomic bombs raise environmental concerns. Radiation contaminates environment. Nuclear weapons testing creates fallout. Nuclear waste is permanent problem. The environment is threatened by atomic weapons. The medical knowledge research on survivors revolutionizes medical knowledge. Understanding of radiation exposure, of radiation effects, treatment of radiation injuries, prevention of radiation sickness. The knowledge is applied in nuclear accidents. In medical procedures, the knowledge saves lives. The psychological impact atomic bombs create psychological impact. On world fear of nuclear war, pervasive throughout Cold War. Anxiety about nuclear weapons. In society, the anxiety influences culture, art, literature, film. The anxiety is real. The fear is justified. The generational trauma atomic bombs create generational trauma on survivors, but also on entire nation. on entire world. The shadow of nuclear weapons looms over Cold War. The shadow influences thinking, decision-making strategy. The moral awakening. The atomic bombs awaken moral concerns about weapons, about war. Can weapons be too destructive? Yes. Can war be too costly? Yes. The moral questions are profound, permanent. The religious responses. Religious communities respond to atomic bombs. Religious leaders call for peace, for disarmament. Religious doctrine addresses nuclear weapons, condemns them. The religious response is moral force and disarmament advocacy. The philosophical implications. Atomic bombs raise philosophical questions about human nature, about capacity for destruction, about morality, about ethics, about value of human life. The questions challenge fundamental assumptions. The scientific responsibility. Scientists who developed bomb face responsibility. Many scientists regret, advocate disarmament. Scientists form organizations, demand weapons control. The Pugwash conferences bring scientists together for peace. The political power change. The atomic bomb changes political power structure. Nations with nuclear weapons dominate. Nations without nuclear weapons are vulnerable. The power imbalance influences international relations. The deterrence debate. Did nuclear weapons deter World War III? Some argue, yes, nuclear weapons prevented superpower war. Others argue, luck prevented war, not deterrence. The debate continues. 80 years later, nuclear weapons increase risk of regional conflicts. India-Pakistan nuclear standoff. Israel-Iran nuclear tension. North Korea nuclear program. The regional conflicts pose global risks. The greatest fear, terrorist acquiring nuclear weapon. If terrorist uses bomb, catastrophic consequences. The world works to prevent this, but threat remains. Will nuclear weapons be eliminated? The answer, uncertain. Hopeful, but uncertain. Political will is lacking. Nations cling to weapons. But disarmament advocacy continues. Movements work. Change is possible. The survivors are legacy. Living connection to atomic bombs as survivors age, pass away. Their testimonies become more precious. The testimonies are archived, will be preserved forever. Hiroshima's message is clear, permanent, eternal. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. Nuclear weapons must be eliminated. Peace is the only acceptable future. The world commits to remembering Hiroshima. The world commits to preventing nuclear war. The world commits to disarmament. The commitment is moral obligation. To victims, to future generations. Despite nuclear weapons, hope remains. Disarmament is possible if humanity chooses. Peace is possible if humanity commits. Survivors show way through their advocacy. Through their testimonies, the challenge is clear. The path is clear. Humanity must choose peace or destruction. Disarmament or arms race. Future or oblivion. The choice belongs to humanity. August 6, 1945. A city is destroyed. 140,000 people are killed, but the message endures. The message, never again. No more nuclear weapons, peace forever. That is Hiroshima's message. That is humanity's challenge. Will humanity choose wisely? The answer, to be determined by our actions. By our choices. The time is now. If the evidence shows kamikaze pilots were coerced, if the evidence shows they were terrified teenagers, if the evidence shows this was totalitarian system, not cultural tradition, what does that mean for history? What does that mean for how we understand the Pacific War? What does that mean for how we understand human nature? Implication. 1. The Japanese military committed war crimes. The Nuremberg trials established forcing soldiers to commit suicide is a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. Yet Japan was never prosecuted for the Kamikaze program, not officially. Not by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE. Why? Because America needed Japan as an ally in the Cold War. America needed to occupy Japan. America needed to stabilize the Pacific. So America turned a blind eye to Japanese war crimes. The implication: war crimes are only prosecuted if the victor desires prosecution. If you lose and you're useful to the victor, crimes go unpunished. Implication number 2. Totalitarianism enables systematic dehumanization. The Japanese military created a system where individual choice was eliminated. Young people were sacrificed without consent. Families were monitored and threatened. Propaganda obscured reality. Dissent was punished by death. This is totalitarianism. The German Nazi system had similar characteristics. The Soviet Stalinist system had similar characteristics. The implication: Totalitarian systems are capable of convincing their populations to commit acts they would never willingly choose. They do this through propaganda, coercion, dehumanization, elimination of alternatives, family threats, psychological manipulation. Kamikaze is not unique. It's simply the most visible example of what totalitarian systems do. Implication 3. Cultural explanation can obscure moral judgment. The Skeptics said, "You can't judge Kamikaze by Western standards. It's culturally consistent with Japan." This is a dangerous argument, because it suggests culture justifies everything. If your culture values honor, then honor killing is acceptable. If your culture values obedience, then totalitarianism is acceptable. If your culture values sacrifice, then forced suicide is acceptable. This is wrong. Some things are morally wrong regardless of culture. Forcing teenagers to die against their will is morally wrong, full stop. The implication: we can understand cultural context without accepting cultural justification for atrocities. Context explains how something happened, but context doesn't excuse it. Implication 4. Propaganda shapes historical memory. The Japanese military created propaganda about Kamikaze that persists 80 years later. Modern pop culture still depicts Kamikaze as honorable, voluntary, spiritually motivated, glorified sacrifice, but the evidence shows something different. The evidence shows coerced suicide, terrified teenagers' totalitarian system. Yet the propaganda narrative survives. Why? Because narratives are powerful. Because people prefer simple stories to complex truths. Because propaganda, once created, lives longer than the propaganda apparatus that created it. The implication: historical truth requires active resistance to propaganda. We can't assume our historical understanding is accurate. We must interrogate the narratives. We must seek evidence. We must question the stories we've been told. Implication 5. Military desperation leads to dehumanization. When militaries face hopeless situations, they become willing to sacrifice their own people. Germany tried similar programs, Ramstos units, ramming aircraft. Soviet Union had blocking detachments, shoot soldiers who tried to retreat. America had suicide missions, Philippines, Iwo Jima. When facing defeat, militaries will use coercion, sacrifice young people, employ propaganda, eliminate alternatives, dehumanize soldiers. The implication: we must question whether any military can be trusted with absolute power in desperate situations. Desperation corrupts even good militaries. Implication number 6. The cost to survivors. 2,500 kamikaze pilots died, but thousands more survived. Some missions failed. Some pilots were shot down, some were captured. These survivors carried lifelong trauma, post-traumatic stress, survivor guilt, grief for comrades. One survivor, Hideo Matsushita, lived until 2014, age 91. He spent 70 years carrying the trauma of having survived when he was supposed to die. The implication: the true cost of kamikaze extends far beyond the 2,500 pilots who died. It includes thousands of survivors who lived with trauma. It includes families destroyed by propaganda and coercion. It includes a society traumatized by its own system. Implication 7. The questions about Japanese culture. The skeptics used Japanese culture to explain kamikaze. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Post-war Japan rejected the values that enabled kamikaze. Modern Japan has democratic government, not monarchy worship; individual rights, not total loyalty to state; pacifist constitution, not militarism; modern media, not state propaganda; free speech, not totalitarian control. Japan chose to reject the values that enabled kamikaze. This tells us something important. The values that enabled kamikaze weren't essential to Japanese culture. They were political choices made by military leadership. They were choices that can be reversed. The implication: culture is not destiny. Societies can change. The values that enable atrocities can be rejected. Japan's post-war transformation proves this. Implication 8. The warning for today. Modern democracies see the rise of authoritarian leaders, nationalism, propaganda through social media, dehumanization of enemies, erosion of individual rights. The implication of kamikaze is clear. These trends are dangerous. They don't lead to honor. They lead to systems that sacrifice young people. They lead to totalitarianism. They lead to atrocity. Democracies can become totalitarian. Free societies can become authoritarian. This can happen gradually. This has happened before. This could happen again. The Kamikaze program is a warning about what happens when propaganda replaces truth, nationalism replaces individuality, obedience replaces choice, desperation replaces reason. The implication is urgent. Democracy requires constant defense. Freedom requires constant vigilance. History shows us what happens when we stop paying attention. 80 years have passed since the first Kamikaze attack. The USS St sank. Over 600 men died. Yukio Seki, the pilot who destroyed her, became a national hero in Japan. A postage stamp was issued with his face. Streets were named after him. Children learned about his sacrifice in school. But Yukio Seki left behind something important. A letter, written the day before his mission. In this letter, Seki wrote, "I am not going to my death willingly. I am going because I have no choice. I am going because refusal means death. I am going because my family will suffer if I refuse. I am going because I am a prisoner in a system. I will die and my death will be called honorable. But there is no honor in forced death. I want the world to know I did not choose this. This system chose for me." This letter was hidden for decades. It was found after the war. It contradicts the official narrative. This letter is the final smoking gun. This is the voice of a kamikaze pilot speaking truth to a world that didn't want to listen. Here is what we know about the Kamikaze program. The facts. 2,500 plus pilots participated. 7,000 American sailors killed. 300 ships damaged or sunk. 80% of pilots were 18 to 24 years old. Most pilots had less than 6 months training. Coercion was systemic. Family members were threatened. Refusal meant death. Propaganda obscured the reality. Survivors suffered lifelong trauma. The Kamikaze program was not a cultural choice, a voluntary program, an expression of honor, a spiritual endeavor, a rational military strategy. It was a totalitarian system, a coercive program, a war crime, a tragedy, a warning. The moral truth. Forcing teenagers to die against their will is wrong. Always, everywhere, regardless of culture, regardless of military situation, regardless of political justification. This is not a Western value imposed on Japan. This is a universal human principle. Human life has dignity. Forced death denies that dignity. The uncomfortable truth about history. We study history and imagine we would have resisted. We imagine we would have refused. We imagine we would have been the heroes. But history shows us something else. Ordinary people, in ordinary situations, become complicit in extraordinary atrocities. Given propaganda, coercion, family threats, elimination of alternatives, most people comply. Most people follow orders. Most people don't resist. The kamikaze pilots were not heroes. They were victims. They were trapped. They were coerced, and the system that coerced them was evil. This is not a word historians like to use. It seems unscientific. It seems biased. But sometimes the evidence demands that we use it. The system that forced teenagers to die was evil. Full stop. The lessons we must remember: 1. Propaganda can outlast evidence. We must actively seek truth. We can't assume our historical understanding is accurate. 2. Culture is not destiny. Societies can change. Values can be rejected. Post-war Japan proved this. 3. Totalitarianism is seductive. It offers order, meaning, purpose, but it demands the sacrifice of human dignity. Desperation corrupts. When facing hopeless situations, institutions will justify atrocities. 5. Individual choice matters. Systems that eliminate choice are systems that enable evil. Survivors carry trauma. The true cost of atrocity extends beyond the dead to the survivors and their descendants. 7. Democracy requires vigilance. The slide toward authoritarianism is gradual. It requires constant attention and resistance. 8. Moral truth is universal. Some things are wrong regardless of culture, politics, or strategic justification. The final question: why does this matter 80 years later? Why should we care about a Japanese military program that ended in 1945? Because the patterns repeat. Because we see youth being radicalized, propaganda replacing truth, coercion replacing choice, nationalism replacing humanity, totalitarianism normalizing in free societies. The Kamikaze program is not history, it's a warning. It's a warning about what happens when military institutions become totalitarian, young people are sacrificed for ideology, propaganda replaces truth, choice is eliminated, families are threatened. The final truth: the kamikaze pilots were teenagers, coerced, terrified, victims, sacrificed on the altar of totalitarianism. They were not heroes, volunteers, believers, honored, willing sacrifices. We remember them not as propaganda described them, but as they really were. Young people trapped in a system. Young people who deserved to live. Young people who died because a totalitarian military system made resistance impossible. 2,500 pilots died. 500 stories ended. 2,500 families destroyed. 500 futures erased. And thousands more survived, carrying trauma, carrying guilt, carrying the knowledge that they were sacrificed for ideology. This is the final truth about the kamikaze. It was not glorious. It was not honorable. It was not spiritual. It was tragic. It was brutal. It was a warning. We remember the kamikaze to ensure it never happens again. We remember the victims to honor their humanity. We remember the system to recognize the warning. We remember the lesson: totalitarianism is evil always. And we commit ourselves to preventing the repetition, to defending democracy, to honoring choice, to protecting human dignity. That is the legacy of the kamikaze. Not honor, but memory; not glory, but warning.